All right, what's going on, everyone? So yesterday, Russia opened a new axis of advance in northeastern Ukraine, sending troops from Belgorod across the border into the Kharkiv region. To get a better idea of how that fight is shaping up, we're going to take a look at some Russian sources as well as Ukrainian sources. Now, starting with a bit of a map overview here to give you an idea of the areas we're going to be looking at. The focus of today's video is going to be up here across the border from Belgorod into the Kharkiv region. Over the course of the last year plus, the majority of the fighting has taken place in the east and the south. So to kind of orient to where some of this is playing out, you've got Bakhmut, of course, a lot of attention over the course of the past year. And just west of Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, we're going to talk about how that plays into current Russian operations. Down here is Avdiivka, of course, a major battle since the start of this war, and we're continuing to see Russian forces push west and north out of that location. Now, moving north quite a ways is where we're getting into where things have played out over the course of the past 48 hours at this point. So this map update from Deep State Map is on May 9th. This is before Russia moved across the border. If we look at how this took place, the first day's operations saw a bit of a push in two different locations, again, generally northeast of the city of Kharkiv. This update here was early on May 10th, just after the operation kicked off. There was another update later in the day on May 10th that shows a significantly more progress by Russian forces. Now, there is some debate right now. Again, there's very limited information coming out, but there's some debate right now also coming from the Russian side about just how heavily defended these areas were, suggesting that they may have been portions of this gray zone. We'll talk about more of that here in a minute, but it's something similar to what we saw in the Ukrainian counteroffensive this past summer, where at certain times it looked like the front line moved quite a bit, but really these were not necessarily undefended areas, but they hadn't yet reached the fortified positions in the summer of the Russian forces, in this case of the Ukrainian forces. So it's not entirely clear where the first line of defense is for Ukraine, but from what I've seen at this point, it doesn't look like Russia has yet reached the first major line of defense. That's not to say that either one of these areas is just open terrain, easy to walk across it. All of this is in artillery and drone range, likely in direct fire range of multiple Ukrainian weapon systems, and Russia has been losing troops and equipment as they move across these areas. However, just based off of reports coming out of both sides, as well as how quickly Russia has been moving, I would say it's safe to say at this point that in both locations, they have not yet reached the Ukrainian first line of defense. Now, looking at a couple official sources here, starting with Ukrainian President Zelensky, he said, quote, "The main topic is the Kharkiv region. Today, Russian troops tried to expand their operations against Ukraine. We understand the size of the occupiers' forces. We see their intentions. Our warriors, our artillery, our drones are retaliating against the occupier. We are adding more forces to the Kharkiv directions, both along our state border and along the entire front line. We will invariably destroy the occupier in a way that will disrupt any Russian offensive intentions." So again, there's a lot coming from Ukraine that they knew this was coming, that they saw this coming. We'll see. It's hard to tell, right? I mean, yesterday we did cite an article published the day before this attack took place of Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv saying they're expecting some sort of attack in this general direction sometime in the near future. We also have an update from the Russian Ministry of Defense. They did not put out anything during the course of the first 24 hours of this operation, but earlier today put out a statement saying, as a result of offensive actions, units of the North Group of troops liberated the settlements. Enemy losses per day amounted to 170 military personnel, 3 armored vehicles, and 3 armored combat vehicles and 4 vehicles, adding that 34 Ukrainian service members were also captured. And we have started to see some pictures and videos being released by Russia, supposedly showing some of these Ukrainian prisoners or Ukrainian soldiers that were captured. Then shifting to, again, we have more information coming out of the Russian side, getting into the details of this. I'm going to start there, looking at some of the mill bloggers. 2 majors right out the gate here, and I'm going to pull the map back up so we have something to look at while we're going over this. He said, despite the first day of the advance of Russian troops, the Russian army has only approached the first line of defense of the armed forces of Ukraine. Again, that's what we were talking about just a moment ago with some of these potentially being this gray zone that exists all along the front line. He said this already in 2022 when Russian troops entered empty villages and populated areas. Despite the seeming incompetence of the Ukrainian formations, the enemy's concrete fortifications, communication networks, and logistics in this area certainly do not make for an easy walk. So again, this is a Russian Telegram channel. very pro-Russia, talking about how don't celebrate quite yet. And we're seeing that across a handful of channels, saying this is not the hard part of the operation. Any advance from here at some point is going to hit the main line of Ukrainian defense. Don't underestimate it. There's going to be a significant fight when that plays out. He added, very similar to the Russian Ministry of Defense statement, about a number of Ukrainian forces that had been taken prisoner. And he said that the Russian armed forces, this is his assessment, two majors assessment, the Russian armed forces have a plan to advance in two directions, east of the Seversky Donetsk. So we'll pull out here a little bit, zoom out here a little bit. This is the Seversky Donetsk River moving through here. So he's saying they're going to advance to the east of this river. And then in the direction of the settlement of Lipsy on the road to Kharkiv. If we move over a little bit west, we'll see that as well. So these are the two areas of advance he's talking about. Shouldn't be anything shocking based off what we've seen on this map. But Area 1, east of the Seversky Donetsk, down here. Area 2, not necessarily in this order, towards the village of Lipsy on the way to Kharkiv. So those are the two areas, according to two majors, to keep an eye on. And I do want to report on something else here that two majors brought up, but also came across on a handful of other Russian Telegram channels. And we have a video here that I'll play as well, where they say in the area of the Old Saltov, forces of the North Group inflicted fire on the dam across the Seversky Donetsk River with one precise strike. The main supply route of the Ukrainian armed forces in the Volshansk-Kharkov region was cut. So the area we're looking at there, to pull the map back up, again, to get an idea, there's a river, body of water, running north to south through here that does potentially isolate forces on either side of that. The dam that they're talking about is right here, and that lines up with the video showing the strike on that dam and the road crossing it. The challenge for Ukraine is as you move north, there's not very many crossing points remaining. I believe this one here was damaged, just looking at some Google Earth imagery, damaged and or destroyed. And then this one up the furthest north, I believe, also suffered damage early in the war. So when you're talking about trying to resupply these troops in the Volshansk area, you're running out of river crossings, right? And you're having to go further and further south to maneuver forces either into that area or out of the area. So again, the dam that appears to have been targeted in that strike right here by this Saltov area. Then shifting over to some Ukrainian sources here. Again, there's not as much coming out in terms of detail from the Ukrainian side right now as the Russian side, but I think it's still worth seeing what's coming from that perspective. Starting with the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, not technically a Ukrainian source, but tend to lean rather pro-Ukrainian throughout this conflict. They say Russian forces began an offensive operation along the Russian-Ukrainian border in northern Kharkiv Oblast on the morning of May 10th and made tactically significant gains. Russian forces are likely conducting the initial phase of an offensive operation in Kharkiv City, north of Kharkiv City, that has limited operational objectives, but is meant to achieve the strategic effect of drawing in Ukrainian manpower and material from other critical sectors of the front in eastern Ukraine. And that's something we talked a little bit about yesterday as the most likely reason for Russia doing this here and for doing this now. So, there's always the concern that there's going to be a breakthrough in the lines. There's been some conversation, speculation that Russia's going to try some sort of large pincer movement to encircle the city of Kharkiv. It's always a concern. We just haven't seen Russia be able to pull off an operation of that size in this war at all. The way Russia has advanced really everywhere since this war began is they bring a city under heavy fires, right? Either air power, artillery, or a combination of both. And they kind of reduce that area to rubble, whether it's a city, town, and then eventually defensive positions. And then infantry forces are able to move in and slowly push out the Ukrainian defenders. There's no reason to expect that Russia has changed that strategy any significant way in the last few days, right? We've seen this recently in Chasiv Yar. It's still taking place in Chasiv Yar, which actually is a good point to bring up here, where when you're talking about Ukrainian forces having to be moved from one location to another in the battlefield, Ukraine is on the defensive all across the front right now. And there's two notable areas, one of which is Chasiv Yar, just west of Bakhmut, where Russian forces continue to kind of hammer this town ahead of what is expected to be kind of a larger assault like we've seen in other villages and towns throughout Ukraine. Ukraine it's not clear that they have the manpower and the equipment to easily move forces from places like Chasiv Yar up north of Kharkiv. So the Russian push into Ukrainian territory here is likely to draw some attention from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense of needing to support that area, send in reinforcements, send in new equipment. But the question is, where from? what area of the front is so stable right now that you can afford to send more equipment over there. Now, not everywhere is under the same intensity of fighting as areas like Chasiv Yar, but some of these areas, when there might not be that much fighting, there's also not that many Ukrainian troops and equipment stashed there, right? So if we come down here closer to Kherson, some of these areas, there's not going to be as many Ukrainian troops. Not going to be, they might have significant fortifications, but they might not be, multiple artillery systems that are held in reserve that aren't being utilized, or artillery ammunition, right? Because the offensive action hasn't been there. So in some of the areas where the fighting has been intense, that's where the reinforcements have gone. That's where the additional ammunition has gone. And now Ukraine is in a position where they're going to have to shift some of that, likely, and Zelensky already talked about doing this, to these areas north of Kharkiv. The question, the main concern for Ukraine, of course, is where does it come from? And then turning to another Ukrainian source here, Maxim Zorin, a commander in the Ukrainian Armed Forces, he said the events in the Kharkiv direction are an absolutely predictable story for the Ukrainian army. So far, nothing critical has happened. The Russians have started a movement that our forces knew about and were preparing for. The main thing to understand is that now it is more like probing our defensive line. The enemy has not yet used its main forces. So again, a couple key points there. A Ukrainian military officer saying they knew this was coming. And we've seen that, again, through reporting as of late. It wasn't a major shock that something took place in Kharkiv. Maybe the exact location was a little surprising, but even Zelensky hinted at, hey, we're watching. We knew where this was going to take place. That kind of lends to the idea that some of these areas that have been taken over are more in the gray zone. And again, that's not to write it off. Ukraine doesn't want to lose territory in any place across the country. But it's entirely likely that they're not going to fight for that, and they're going to fall back to the main line of defense. The second thing that Zorin points out here that I think is notable is saying we don't know what the main effort looks like. This is a probing attack. Yesterday, we talked about 3 to 4 battalions being used across this entire front. That's a small size for this war. And there's an argument that I have seen some speculation that between 30 and 50,000 Russian troops are available to move into this fight. Now, it's a double-edged sword. Where are they coming from? And the same argument can be had that if Ukraine has to pull forces from Chasiv Yar, where heavy fighting is happening right now, Russia also has to pull forces if they're going to commit significant manpower to somewhere else along the front. So one of the challenges in trying to predict where this fight is going and how it's going to play out is, of course, all of us. On the outside, we don't have a clear picture of the strength and material capabilities within the Ukrainian or the Russian armed forces as it sits today. But that's all I got for now. Now, there's not going to be an update video for the next 2 days. Tomorrow's Mother's Day. Got to spend some time with the family. And then on Monday, I'm actually traveling down to Miami to speak at the NATO Youth Summit, which I can't wait. I don't know how I snuck in the door, but they got some really smart people up on that stage. Looking forward to getting down there, meeting some of those folks, interacting with the crowd, and learning a lot. I'll plan to share as much as I can across different social platforms while I'm there, anything that I think you all might be interested in. And I'll put a link in the description. It is going to be live streamed if you want to tune in and watch any portion of that, and then record it as well. But that's it. I'll be back on Tuesday. So thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.